Hello, friends. I hope that you are having a wonderful Wednesday. Yes, Wednesday. I know I kind of dropped the bomb there, but it is going to work so much better with my school schedule that I post episodes now on Wednesdays instead of Monday. So that is a new change. I hope that you guys are okay with it. It's what is going to work best for me and my schedule. This week has been pretty awesome. I've gotten to spend more time with friends. I have been more connected with family. And I also got some really awesome news. So I had a meeting with my academic advisor, and I found out that I can actually graduate in May. You guys have no idea how awesome that is. I was originally going to graduate after the summer semester, but talking to the advisor, they're going to have a semester before the spring where you can take one accelerated class for 3 weeks, and then I will take the rest of the classes during the spring. It will be crazy because I do have 21 credits left, but technically it's only 18 during the full season. Which, I'm already used to taking a lot of classes, so I might as well just do it, get it over with, and graduate. Then that means I can get the summer off, travel, do whatever I want, and then in the fall I can go straight into my master's program. So that has been an update for me. Life has been good. I hope you guys are doing well. And today we're going to talk about Sigmund Freud. Ooh. There are a lot of different perspectives and opinions on Freud, but I find his work very fascinating. So today we're going to dive in. I'm your host, Katie Gonzalez, and you're listening to What the Psychology. Alright, so Sigmund Freud is undoubtedly one of psychology's most famous figures. He is also one of the most influential and controversial thinkers of the 20th century. Sigmund Freud's theories and work helped shape our views on childhood, personality, memory, sexuality, and therapy. Other major thinkers have contributed work that grew out of Freud's legacy, while others developed new theories in opposition to his ideas. Which is also good because if you really think about it, back in the time, he is pretty much the founder of this field. And there were no other ideas floating around at the time. So although we can criticize his works, which, they need to be, some of them definitely, then if he never even came up with anything, what would we have to criticize? What would we have to grow from? So I just want you guys to reflect on that as we do go through these because some of his theories are pretty weird. Not only in today's standards, but definitely back then. Alright, so a little background on Sigmund Freud. He was born Sigismund Shlomo Freud on 6 May 1856, and he died on 23 September 1939. He was actually an Austrian neurologist and the founder of Psychoanalysis, a clinical method for treating psychopathology through dialogue between a patient and psychoanalyst, which we'll get into a little bit later. Freud was actually born to Jewish parents in the Moravian town of Freiburg in the Austrian Empire, and this is now in the Czech Republic. And he was actually the oldest child of 8 children. Both of his parents, they were from Galicia. It's a historic province straddling modern-day West Ukraine and southeast Poland. So his father, Jacob Freud, he was actually a wool merchant, and he had 2 sons, Emmanuel and Philip, by his first marriage. His family, so his father's family, they were Hasidic Jews, and although Jacob himself had moved away from the tradition, he came to be known for his Torah study. So him and Freud's mother, Amelia Nathanson, who was 20 years younger than him, and his third wife, they were married by Rabbi Isaac Noah Mannheimer on 29 July 1855. And at that point, that's when they did have 8 children. So 2 of those children that his father had were before him. So really, his dad had 10 children. So they were struggling financially, and they were living in a rented room in a locksmith's house at Schlossergasse when their son Sigmund was born. And he, of course, was the first of 8 children. In 1859, the Freud family left Freiburg, and Freud's half-brothers, they actually immigrated to Manchester, England. So Jacob Freud took his wife and 2 children. This at the time was Freud's sister Anna, who was born in 1858, and his brother Julius, who was born in 1857. Unfortunately, he died in infancy. Firstly to Leipzig, and then in 1860 to Vienna, where 4 sisters and a brother were born. Rosa, Marie, Adolphine, Paula, Alexander. In 1865, the 9-year-old Freud, he actually entered a prominent high school, and I have the name, and I do not know if I will be able to pronounce this. It's Leopoldstadter Communal Gymnasium. He proved to be an outstanding student, and he actually graduated from the Matura in 1873 with honors. And Sigmund Freud, he loved literature. He was proficient in many languages to include German, French, Italian, Spanish, English, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. And, I mean, I can speak English, Southerner, and a little bit of Spanish. So, that's insane. And one thing we don't talk about is other countries in the world. They are known to be proficient in like 3 or 4 other languages. So, I kind of wish the United States was a little bit more towards that. But that's one thing I would change if I could. Moving on, Freud, he entered the University of Vienna at age 17. He had planned to study law, but he actually joined the medical faculty at the university, where his studies included philosophy under Franz Brentano, physiology under Ernest Bruck, and zoology under Darwinist Professor Karl Claus. In 1876, Freud spent 4 weeks at Claus's Zoological Research Station in Trieste, dissecting hundreds of eels in an inconclusive search for their male reproductive organs. In 1877, Freud then moved to Ernst Bruck's Physiology Laboratory, where he spent 6 years comparing the brains of humans and other vertebrates with those of frogs, and invertebrates such as crawfish and lampreys. Okay, I would not want that job because you guys already know how I feel about frogs. So his research on the biology of nervous tissue proved seminal for the subsequent discovery of the neuron in the 1890s. So his work had profound effects. Even if there are things he didn't discover necessarily, his research led to those discoveries. So that's pretty cool. I never knew he was linked to the neuron. Freud's research work was interrupted in 1879 by the obligation to undertake a year's compulsory military service. The lengthy downtimes enabled him to complete a commission to translate 4 essays from John Stuart Mill's collected works. And he actually graduated with a medical degree in March of 1881. Throughout his career, he did publish many books. A few of those are listed as The Interpretation of Dreams, The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, Totem and Taboo, Civilization and Its Discontents, and The Future of an Illusion. So there are many theories that Freud came up with, and they are very controversial, at least some of them are, and we are going to go into more of those. Alright, so let's talk about psychoanalysis and the psychoanalytic theories that he came up with. The underlying theme of these is that human behavior are dynamic interactions between the conscious and the unconscious minds. And classic Freudian psychoanalytic theory, there are 3 levels of awareness that differently influence thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. 3 conflicting aspects of personality influenced by awareness and development, and psychosexual stages influenced by fixation, or even lack thereof, on erogenous zones. Now, the psychoanalytic levels of awareness are the conscious mind, which is what we are presently aware of, the preconscious mind, which is what is stored in one's memory that one isn't presently aware of but can access. And then there's the unconscious mind, which is part of our mind that we can't become aware of. Now, when it comes to psychoanalysis therapy, the therapeutic techniques such as the use of free association and transference are used. And he had a client, and she was invited to talk about her symptoms while under hypnosis. So she would coin the phrase talk and cure for her treatment. But in the course of talking in this way, her symptoms become reduced in severity as she retrieved memories of traumatic incidents associated with their onset. The inconsistent results of Freud's early clinical work eventually led him to abandon hypnosis, and he just encouraged patients to talk freely, without any censorship or inhibition about whatever ideas or memories. In conjunction with this procedure, which that is what he called free association, he found that patients' dreams could be fruitfully analyzed to reveal the complex structuring of unconscious material and to demonstrate the psychic action of repression, which he did conclude underlay symptom formation. So by 1896, he was using the term psychoanalysis to refer to this new clinical method that he came up with and the theories on which it was based. The goal of Freudian therapy or psychoanalysis was to bring repressed thoughts and feelings into consciousness to free the patient from suffering repetitive, distorted emotions. Now, classically, the bringing of unconscious thoughts and feelings to consciousness is brought about by encouraging a patient to talk about dreams and engage in free association, in which patients report their thoughts without reservation, and they make no attempt to concentrate while doing so. Another important element of this is transference, which I mentioned before, and this is the process by which patients displace onto their analysis feelings and ideas which derive from previous figures in their lives. This was first seen as a regrettable phenomenon that interfered with the recovery of repressed memories and disturbed patients' objectivity, but by 1912, Freud had come to see it as an essential part of the therapeutic process. So very interesting. This is how therapy got started, and nowadays they use different methods of conducting therapy, but this is where it all began. Now, Sigmund Freud, he also had a psychoanalytic personality structure, and they are like three different components. There's the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id, it's part of personality that a person is born with, where the biological, instinctual drives reside. So it's like the body's needs, wants, and desires. And this is located in the unconscious mind. This is also known as the pleasure principle, because it's what your body needs, what it wants, what it desires. So this can be food, thirst, sex, things like that. The next part is the ego. And it's kind of funny in culture. I feel like we use ego as a different term than what it's actually meant to be. In Freud's structure, the ego is part of personality that starts developing in the first year of life. And it's to find realistic outlets for the id's drive. This is the reality principle, and it's the executive mediator. Whereas today in culture, we kind of see the ego as pride and being super confident or being overly confident. Whereas this is more of finding reality. I don't know, that's my thoughts on it. The third part is called the superego. And this is part of the personality that represents one's conscience and idealized standards of behavior. This is also known as the morality principle. So things that you've known as culturally correct or religiously correct. And I want you to picture, you know how in the movies there'll be like a person and there'll be like a devil on their shoulder and then the angel on another, and they're kind of trying to convince them to do one thing or the other. Well, think about a person having an angel and a devil on their shoulders, but also having a mediator on the top of their head. So the angel is the superego, using morality as a way to convince them to take action or not take action. Think of the devil as the id, which is the pleasure principle, the person wanting to do something, having a desire, that type of thing. And then think of the mediator as the ego, which is using reality as a way to sort of figure out what is the actual best way to go about things. So just a little fun picture. I always think of the devil and angel on the shoulders as a good example to maybe better explain the relationship between those three. Now, probably one of the most controversial theories that Sigmund Freud did have was his theory on psychosexual development. And his theory proposes that there's infantile sexuality. The sexual drives pass through the distinct developmental phases, which we are going to talk about. But like I said, we have to think of this time. There was nothing really talking about the development of sexuality or anything. This was not something openly talked about back in that time. So I think for him to even try to propose something through observation, although we kind of look at it now as that's very controversial and there's no way that that is even a thing, I think the fact that he even tried to propose something is still remarkable, even though it's controversial. So there's a stage, an erogenous zone, and an activity focus. And this was his theory on development. So the oral stage, which is from birth to 1.5 years old, the erogenous zone is mouth, lips, and tongue, and the activity focus is sucking, biting, and chewing. Of course, you have infants that are usually being breastfed, they chew on things, they kind of bite. So that's where he got that perspective from. Now, the anal stage, which is from age 1.5 to 3 years old, the erogenous zone is the anus, and the activity focus is bowel retention and elimination. For me, this doesn't really make much sense because even as a baby, babies constantly poop and things like that. So I think that in this stage, his whole proposition was that that's usually when they're being potty trained and they're learning how to properly eliminate their bowels. But it's very interesting. It doesn't talk about anything like peeing or anything like that. And of course, these are just my thoughts based on his theory. Okay, then you have the phallic stage, which is from age 3 to age 6. And the erogenous zone is the genitals. Now, the activity focus here is genital stimulation at reaction to the opposite sex, and then later identifying with the same-sex parent to learn gender role and sense of morality. Now, what is crazy about this is that we do know today that there has been a lot of research and that kids actually develop an understanding of gender at around age 5. So it's very interesting that he did propose this. But the thing is, he's saying that kids were stimulating their genitals because they were based off of the reaction to the opposite sex. However, I would propose that that's probably just mainly from curiosity. We know that little boys, they usually play with their pee-pee, and I don't really know about little girls, honestly. But I have friends that have boys, and sometimes their boys will do that. But honestly, I think it's because of curiosity and not what Freud proposed. Moving on. Then you have the latency stage, which is from ages 6 years to puberty. And at this time, there is no erogenous zone. And the activity focus is cognitive and social development. That kind of makes sense. The whole erogenous zone thing just don't make sense to me. Then the last stage is called the genital stage, which is from puberty to adulthood. And the erogenous zone is the genitals. And the activity focus is development of sexual relationships, moving toward intimate adult relations. Now that does make sense, but what is crazy to me is after adulthood, there's no other stages that Freud proposed. But I also think people back then didn't live as long as they do today, so maybe he didn't observe much from development of elderly folks. But that would have been very interesting. So with those theories in mind, Freud also proposed something called the Iopus Complex. Okay, so this complex was kind of built off of the Psychosexual Development, and this refers to a child's unconscious sexual desire for the opposite sex parent and hatred for the same sex parent. So this pretty much theorizes that if me and my husband had a girl, that the girl would be the daughter, the girl, would be more drawn to my husband, but have hatred for me. Which doesn't really make much sense because, honestly, you see more kids, regardless of their sex, that are drawn to their moms. But we do have that notion of mama's boy, daddy's girl. So I don't know if that kind of came from this. But so Freud, he considered that the child's identification with the same-sex parent is the successful outcome of the complex, and that unsexual outcome of the complex might lead to neurosis. So he was saying that eventually they wouldn't really hate the same-sex parents, they would eventually identify with them, and that would be successful. So, very odd. It's a theory he had. Like I said earlier, because of his works, many people came for support of him or out of opposition of his theories. So we learned and we grew from his originality, whether we agree with them or not. We can still say that it was very significant at the time. So I did talk a little bit earlier, I mentioned dreams very briefly, and Sigmund Freud had different theories about our dreams, which now today are pretty much completely irrelevant with modern day science, but we're going to dive into this anyway. His theory was that our wishes and fulfillments, they provided him with models for the clinical analysis of symptom formation and the underlying mechanism of repression. For Freud, every dream was meaningful, no matter how nonsensical it may seem or how little of it we remember. He actually argued that our dreams are nothing more than wishes that we are looking to fulfill in our waking lives. Some of these wishes are relatively innocent, and in other cases, our dreams picture the wish just as it is. However, there are other wishes that are so unacceptable to us, such as sexual or aggressive impulses, that we can't admit to it or act out, and that our dreams have to censor them. So this leads to the interpretation of dreams. Because such unacceptable wishes are typically suppressed by the conscious waking mind, but turn up in the dream in an unrecognizable and often bizarre way, with the help of a psychoanalyst like Freud himself, the methods of free association, Freud argued that the wish behind the dream could be discovered and could be interpreted. Now, when it came to dreams, there are two types of content of dreams. So the first one is to manifest. And the manifest content is the actual literal subject matter of the dream. So I had a dream of a dog chasing me. That's the literal subject matter of the dream. The latent dream is the underlying meaning of the symbols of the dream. So it's the real dream, and the goal of dream interpretation is to reveal what it is. Now, there are 4 mechanisms of the latent dream that can be obscured. So first, there's condensation. This is the reduction and simplification of rich contents of the dream. There's displacement, so the process that substitutes various aspects, so significance, properties, intensity, etc., of the manifest dream, and latent dream to render them dissimilar. Then there's symbols, which is the dream is expressed by relevant signs. And then secondary revision, which is making disordered and incoherent dream materials more well organized and reasonable. So these were ways to try to organize and figure out how to interpret the dream. So if a dog is chasing me, they could try to interpret that maybe it's a symbol that I am afraid of something, or maybe that how I deal with my own fears is that I tend to run away. That's just an example. That's not exact reality. Whereas nowadays, it might just be, well, you just had a dream of a dog chasing you. Although, I do think it's interesting because, as you know, I am a very spiritual person. I am a Christian. And I do know that in the Old Testament, it does talk about Moses interpreting dreams. I don't know, very interesting. Maybe there is something to actual interpretation, or maybe that was just a gift that God gave Moses at the time. Now, it is funny that I talked about the fake dream that I talked about the dog running away. And so Freud proposed that to deal with anxieties and arousing impulses, we have defense mechanisms. And I think even today this is pretty current. I think most people kind of actually accept this, but maybe not to its full extent. Other psychologists have revised this or added more to it or changed different things. But I do think the reality of this is that when it does come to stress or anxiety or fear or, I don't know, anything of a hardship, that we do try to defend against that. So now the first one is regression, which I did mention when we're talking about psychosexual stage. And this is when you retreat to a more infantile stage where some psychic energy remains fixated. There's the reaction formation, which is switching unacceptable impulses into their opposites. Then you have projection, which is disguising one's own threatening impulses by attributing them to others. Then you have rationalization, which is offering self-justifying explanations in place of the real, more threatening unconscious reasons for one's actions. So you're pretty much trying to explain why you do things. Then you have displacement, which is shifting sexual or aggressive impulses toward a more acceptable or less threatening object or person. Now, this is very interesting when I was reading this, because the displacement part makes me think of when we were talking about phobias and how we were talking about desensitization. Because remember, desensitization was taking that fear, that anxiety, and changing it to being in a more relaxing state. So I do think that they took the displacement theory from Freud and used it as a type of therapy. So instead of like sexual aggressive impulses, it would be more of a fear impulse toward a less threatening object or person. I think that has to do with that therapy, although it is slightly different. I think they derived it from Freud. I could be wrong, but that's going to be Katie's theory. Now, denial, this is very common. This is refusing to believe or even perceive painful realities. So we know that that one definitely stuck. So like I said, you can have your opinions about Freud, and you can think he's disgusting about especially some of the psychosexual theories and stuff, but you have to think of how smart this guy was to create all of this out of nothing, and how some of it has stuck today, and others, they just were like, no, there's no way that... and came up with something better. Isn't that what science is all about? Now, Freud also had a proposition of life and death drives. He believed that the human psyche is subject to two conflicting drives, the life drive, or libido, and the death drive. Which I think is weird how he was very focused on sexuality, but whatever. The life drive was also termed eros, and the death drive, thanatos, which I think is funny because it's very close to phantos. Although Freud did not use the latter term, thanatos, that was actually introduced in this context by Paul Federn. So Freud hypothesized that the libido is a form of mental energy with which processes, structures, and object representations are invested. Which now we know that the libido is more of a sexual part of your body. And I also don't like that there wasn't a lot of detail on this when I was doing my research. However, what came to mind when I was reading this was I thought of the movie series called Saw, and I think I've only watched the first few movies when I was younger, but it's pretty much about this crazy clown throwing people in situations that they have to escape, and it's a life or death situation. And they conclude in the movie that most people don't want to die, they want to try to live no matter what they have to do. So, very interesting, and that is what came to mind when I was reading through this. Now we're going to talk about a few other things that have little to do with his theories and more about his life. And what is very interesting about Freud is that he was a user of cocaine. Yup. As a medical researcher, Freud was an early user and proponent of cocaine as a stimulant as well as analgesic. He actually believed that cocaine was a cure for many mental and physical problems. And in his 1884 paper, it was titled On Coca, which is actually the plant that cocaine comes from, he extolled its virtues. Between 1883 and 1887, he wrote several articles recommending medical applications, including its use as an antidepressant. he narrowly, and I mean narrowly, missed out on obtaining scientific priority for discovering its anesthetic properties, of which he was aware of, but had mentioned only in passing. He never permanently wrote it down anywhere, which is funny because later that's kind of what they used cocaine as, because at the time they heavily used morphine, and morphine was quite addictive, but I don't think he realized the addictive properties of cocaine. But so he would actually recommend cocaine as a cure for morphine addiction. Kind of silly from what we know today. So he had introduced cocaine to his best friend Ernst von Fleischl-Marxell, who had become addicted to morphine, taken to relieve years of excruciating nerve pain resulting from an infection acquired after injuring himself while performing an autopsy. I wonder how that went. Like, he was in an autopsy and injured himself? That's probably quite a story. I wish I had more on that. So Freud claimed that his friend was cured of his addiction and that it was premature, although he never acknowledged that he had been at fault, because then his friend developed an acute case of cocaine psychosis and soon returned to using morphine, dying a few years later still suffering from intolerable pain. You have to remember, back then they had few drugs available for anesthetics, for pain relief, for surgery. Painkillers were not a thing. So they were using what they could, but the problem was with the dosages and not knowing the full properties of these drugs. They wouldn't know the effects. They didn't know the risks versus the rewards. They didn't know how much to give them. Back then, they just didn't have the information that we have today. Now, the application as an anesthetic turned out to be one of the few safe uses of cocaine. And as reports of addiction and overdose began to filter in from many places in the world, Freud's medical reputation became somewhat tarnished. In my opinion, it's kind of like what today, we have one thing and then we come up with something new, something better. And maybe cocaine wasn't the best thing, but he was just trying to figure out something that would work. Also, back then they didn't have the FDA, they didn't have regulations, they didn't have processes to make sure that these certain type of drugs were safe. So they would just be like, here's a drug, let's try it and see what happens. So after the cocaine episode, Freud ceased to publicly recommend the use of the drug, but he did continue to take it himself occasionally for depression, migraines, and nasal inflammation during the early 1890s before discontinuing its use in 1896. I find this interesting because it says nasal inflammation, and I don't know, you think that it would cause that. I know that people that do cocaine, why their nose bleeds is because it punctures the nasal membrane, so that's usually why people have a lot of nosebleeds, but I'm not too sure about the inflammation and if it causes that. I am taking a drug awareness course this semester, so that's how I know about some of these. And I do want to do a later episode on drugs or have a series on them and talk about a specific one and go into its effects and different things. So that's something to look forward to. Now, very interestingly enough, in January of 1933, that's when the Nazi Party took control over Germany, and Freud's books were prominent among those they burned and destroyed. So it's kind of crazy. I wonder if there's things that they burned and destroyed that we don't know about, or maybe they did retain everything. But Freud, he did remark to his friend Ernest Jones. He said, "What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Now they are content with burning my books." But Freud, he did continue to underestimate the growing Nazi threat, and he actually remained determined to stay in Vienna, even following the Anschluss of 13 March 1938. And that's when Nazi Germany actually annexed Austria, and the outbreaks of violent anti-Semitism ensued. There were people that tried to convince him to leave. Jones, who was then the president of the International Psychoanalytic Association, or the IPA, they actually flew into Vienna from London on 15 March, and they were pretty much determined to get Freud to change his mind. They wanted him to seek exile into Britain. They wanted to protect him at all costs because he had so many theories, he had so many works, and they wanted to keep him safe. Even though if they burned his books, they needed to keep him safe. They needed his ideas. I mean, this was revolutionary in that time. So this prospect and the shock of the arrest and interrogation of Anna Freud, which was his wife, by the Gestapo, that is what convinced Freud that it was time to leave Austria. So luckily he got out of Austria, he survived, all is well for Freud and his family. But I just think of how stubborn he was. Like, what if they never interrogated his wife? What if they captured them, put them on a train, and sent them to Auschwitz or something? Like, what would have happened? What other discoveries that he came to later would we have known about or not known about? Luckily, they got out of there. So, now, Freud's enduring contributions. So these are things that we still look at and we pretty much accept today. His concept of unconscious motivation. Early experience can affect later development. So he had a theory that if you were exposed as a child to like trauma, that can affect your later development. Parenting styles can affect later development. Those things. And those things were outrooted by his theories. Another one is the important role of emotions and the subconscious. Very prevalent today. Also, change as occurring through conflict resolution. So although Freud had many theories that we can kind of look at and be like, ooh, he seems like a pervert and things like that, honestly, no one else was coming up with this stuff at the time. They just weren't. And even though back in that day and even today we go, whoa, wait a second, why would anyone think that? We have to remember that no one else at the time was coming up with anything. And he was just exploring, he was proposing things that he saw from his viewpoint, things that he observed, and was saying, hey, this might be a cause of this, or these might be the stages of development in their mind and their sexuality. Although now we don't accept things like that, like I said, he did have many contributions. He did have an impact. Even if people did not agree with his ideas and they vividly opposed them, they developed new theories that were better. But they would have never been able to do that without him. So that's all I have to say on Freud. I do think that although some of his works are questionable, he is still one of the most famous known and pretty much founders of the field of psychology. So I don't know, do you have any theories that you would like to propose? What do you think was his most impactful theory? What do you think was his craziest? And what do you think about his use of cocaine? I'm your host, Katie Gonzalez, and you're listening to What the? Psychology. Stay psyched, y'all.